the title is They Sell Themselves, Don't They? Well, they don't really, do they? It'd be great if they did. I don't know how many of you got caught up in the mayhem last year with people refusing to honour contracts that they've made and buy products. But I was thinking that what might be useful is to talk about the difference between the relationship between the buyers and the sellers, and particularly dealing with big retailers. Now, one of my colleagues, when he started selling to some of the bigger retailers, to Homebase, he said it was fantastic. He thought it was all of his birthdays come at once, and he was going to make a fortune and end up somewhere in the Bahamas. But he said the problem was, in year 2, it was a bit like heroin overdose, because what actually happened was you ended up having to pay more and more money for an increasingly lower high, to such a point that he decided it probably wasn't actually worth dealing with them at all. Here's a question. What have these companies got in common? All of these companies in the last 18 months have made unilateral demands for money from people that supply them. So here's an example. Has anybody heard of the GSCOP, the Grocery Supply Code of Practice? Anybody heard of that? No reason why you would have done, but that's a lovely piece of legislation that was put in to stop the big retailers abusing small suppliers. Now, bearing in mind Sainsbury's are a signatory to this and they're legally obliged to stick to it, they unilaterally lengthened their standard payment terms to 75 days for all non-food suppliers, of which anybody here would be. Now, and the reason they can do that is because they're not legally obligated to do this with anything except groceries. Quite why they wouldn't stick to the spirit of the agreement, I don't know. So they unilaterally increased their payment days. Laura Ashley asked for an immediate cost reduction of 10% and then just deducted it. John Lewis, these are supposed to be the goodies. These are all, caring, sharing, cooperative, everybody's in this together. They demanded rebates of 5.25% from suppliers, all suppliers, just after they'd announced record profits. Selfridges, if you want paying within 60 days, you've got to give them 3%. Right? 60 days. If you want paying properly, you've got to give them 5%. And this is just unilaterally against all suppliers. Debenhams, Merry Christmas everybody. 8 days before Christmas, they wrote to all their suppliers saying, we're taking 2.5% off your account, have a nice Christmas. I'm sure some of you were on the receiving of this as well. Homebase sent out a demand for 2% on all orders placed from the 1st of March. And perhaps the most interesting one here is Halfords. Halfords demanded 10%, but what a lot of their suppliers have done is they banded together and they've got together with some lawyers and they're actually suing Halfords because it's a breach of the Competition Act. It's a scandalous abuse of a dominant position in some of the industries they're in. Probably a bit closer to home. Now, bear in mind, First Milk are supposed to represent the producers. They've suddenly gone to all their producers, unlucky, we'll take another 1.15 pence per litre off the buying price that you're going to get for your products. Now, I don't know what you think, but I don't think this is really particularly equitable. General agreement on that? Be hard to argue that. Could have been a rhetorical question, that one, couldn't it? And what the Competition Commission called it, they called this the waterbed effect. So what you've got here is you've got all the big retailers putting pressure on the manufacturers in the middle, and what that does is it forces the manufacturers to put the price up to the retailers on the end. Do you get that? Is that nod? Be all right? Did I explain that? Okay. Okay. Now the point is, there's an automatic assumption that if you buy a lot, you pay less. But that absolutely isn't true. I did a lot of work for a number of manufacturers that sell to these big retailers. And the first question I ask them is, do you have defensible pricing? And to a man, they say no. And when you question them further and say, well, who gets the best prices and why, they say the people that put us under the most pressure are the ones that get the best prices. Now, that doesn't mean they shout and scream and they get angry and they beat them up. What it does mean is that they're thoughtful about the way that they exert pressure. Now, when Tesco acquired One Stop, you would assume that Tesco would be buying generally better than One Stop, wouldn't you? That would seem a reasonable assumption. When they looked at their ice cream prices, they found that on a like-for-like basis, One Stop were buying 60 million quid a year cheaper than Tesco on a like-for-like basis, which you wouldn't expect. So don't assume that because they buy a lot, they buy better. Often they do, but that's not necessarily true. Now, I guess the question you've got to ask is, well, who can help sort of get rid of some of this inequity? Well, if you think about it, the HTA can't really help you that much, can they? Because they're in a very difficult position. They're trying to do stuff for the entire industry. They can't side with either the suppliers or the buyers. They have to try and do everything for the whole industry. So they can't really help you, only in sort of a holistic way. If you look at the NFU, would you agree with me that on balance the risk is in this industry is probably with the growers rather than the retailers generally? See a lot of nodding there, so I think that one's probably true. So what the NFU have tried to do is they've tried to redress this. So the first thing they did was the Code of Garden Trading Practice for Ornamental Sellers. You all heard it? It's quite catchy, isn't it? But you all heard of that one? No? OK. Anybody here got them in their contracts with their trading partners? No. Well done, NFU. Don't know how much that cost us, but well done. Then they brought out the Fruit and Veg Pledge, right? Anybody heard of that one? No? Oh, well done. The purpose of it was to improve the relationships and balance risk. Sounds like a pretty great thing to do. Sounds fair, reasonable, agreed? Now, if you look at what they actually asked for, growers pledged to, I won't read all through this, but growers pledged to run their businesses properly, right? That's what that actually says. What the retailers they want them to do is commit to purchase a proportion of the crop at a previously agreed price. Well, under contract law, they probably have anyway, but the issue is, can you force them to honour the contracts that they've made or not? It's not whether they've made the contracts, can you force them to? Adopt a flexible production-led approach. It's hard enough to run your own retail operation. Why are they going to want to bother to get involved in all the problems that are incumbent in actually growing stuff? Why would they want to do that? Seek out opportunity to utilise the whole crop. If there's not consumer demand for it, why would they bother doing that? Then this one, when in season, commit to increasing the proportion of British fruit and veg that's available for customers to buy. I actually think that's illegal under the Treaty of Rome. I mean, it's a good idea, but I don't think it's legal. So, how many growers do you think signed up to the Fruit and Veg Pledge? Nice round number. Nobody did. So it's all great, fantastic ideas, but it's actually not going anywhere. So I think we probably need to agree the NFU can't really help you because what they're trying to do is a bit too simplistic and it's a little bit too... I hesitate to say the word naive in case there's anyone from the NFU around, but you're just never going to force that through. And then, of course, there's the government stuff, which is all there to help us. And we've got the Groceries Code Adjudicator. Anybody heard of them? In the middle of last year, there was a lady called Christine Take-On that was actually made Groceries Code Adjudicator. She was there to enforce the Grocery Supply Code of Practice and to stop the supermarkets doing naughty things. That's essentially what she was there for. Now, they've investigated 3 things since last June. The first one was Tesco. Suppliers were asked to pay for eye-level display. So if you wanted your products at eye level, you had to pay. Very, very clear, flagrant breach of the GSCOP. You're just not allowed to do that. So what was their excuse? It was an error. It was a rogue buyer. Right, so now bear in mind, we're talking about a £60 billion turnover organisation with hundreds of compliance officers and lawyers, loads of training, and we've got a rogue buyer, right? So what was the penalty? The swingeing penalty here was they had to email all the suppliers affected to advise that it was an error, right? That was the penalty for Tesco. Then we look at the co-op. Now, what the co-op have done here is they've said, we haven't made enough money on this year as much as we expected. You've got to fund the difference, suppliers. That's what the co-op have done. Again, flagrant breach of the GSCOP. And we have the old one category rogue buyer ploy. And, of course, swinging penalties here. The buyer had to be trained more on the code and send out retraction emails. Absolutely devastating penalty for the co-op. And the third one was Morrison's. Now, this is the interesting thing. Under the GSCOP, you can make requests, right? But you can't make them requirements. Now, you tell me the difference between a request and a requirement when they're your single biggest customer and you stop dealing with them and you go out of business. They feel a bit like requirements to me. But in any case, so what they did is they then deducted, without agreement, from 67 suppliers for this initiative. And their excuse, it was a mistake. And their penalty, they had to pay the money back. Right now, call me old-fashioned. If you start to, as we say in South Croydon, grass up your suppliers to the groceries code, that is not without risk. It's even more risky if they're not going to do anything about it when you grass them up. Now, about 3 days ago, there's this other thing that of course, forensic auditing. Anybody ever heard of that? What they do is they send round accountants who go round and say, actually, from 4 years ago, we reckon you owe us this for this promotion that you haven't paid. They call that forensic auditing. The retailers will make agreements with suppliers of some nature, usually for promotions where there's a bonus attached to the promotion, or whether there's a lump sum payable for marketing or something like that. Now, what they're doing is they're employing people to go back through all the books and the buyer's notes and the buyer's records and say, actually, we haven't invoiced you for that, we want the money. Now, what's happening is they have been going back up to 6 years to do it, and the massive leap forward is they can only do it 2 years plus the current year, so they can only go back 3 years. Now, we're talking about organisations that have got more bean counters than you can wave a big stick at. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect to sort them out in the financial year or as a minimum the year before. But even better, these ones haven't signed up to it. My point is, they're not going to help you. And the cost of this, right, the budget was £800,000 to run this fantastic Wango, and we made a Freedom of Information Act saying, well, how much did it cost you? And they won't tell us, because it's not in the public interest. Isn't it? I would have thought that these big relationships with one company bashing up other companies probably is in the public. Agreed? So I suppose the thing is, before you get all the razor blades out, because I think I've probably painted quite a dismal picture of what's going on, there is stuff you can do. And there's stuff that you can all do. And I think one of the things, there are only two forms of competitive advantage. The first is cost leadership. I think we've probably got to admit we're probably not going to get that, whatever happens. But the second is differentiation. Now, the way you can differentiate is you can actually understand your consumers better than anyone else. What I thought was really interesting is, if you promise not to tell my wife, I'm going to tell you, we've got the Lidl comic here. In the Lidl comic, they are offering hydrangeas for £7.49, right? And I thought, is that expensive or not? Because I don't remember the last time I bought a hydrangea. But Garden Centre Group are £14.99, Dobbies are £10, Waitrose £12.99, and Raglan are 12 quid. So that's cheap. So what they're saying is, we're going to eat everybody else's lunch, and we're just going to cherry pick, like they have in other industries, what we can take hold of. So you absolutely have to understand the consumer. The thing, I mean, we've looked at various things in this industry, and the thing that stands out a mile is there isn't really enough information being shared from one side to the other. Would you generally agree with that? Yeah, and it's very difficult to get independent data. Now, what I would advocate that you do is, with your trading partners, make sure that you share information with them, but make sure that you share information at the same level. So if they're sharing detailed information with you, you share detailed information with them. Because if you share detailed information and they share trivial information, you run the risk of getting exploited. So the issue is, share data at the same level. The other thing you can do is, if you're running a retail store, if you're running a garden centre, you can talk to the customers, but you're probably busy putting the plants out, but you could actually talk to the customers. You could watch what they put in their basket. You could ask them questions. You could say to them, well, actually, you bought that one. What would I have had to do to get you to buy one of those and one of those as well? You can ask them, but you don't, because you're too busy doing the stuff that actually, you're too busy doing the doing rather than the thinking. There's a guy called Professor Andrew Fern who runs Kent Business School in the University of Kent, and he said, data sharing is significantly influenced by perception of fairness and how the rewards are distributed. So if, for instance, you decide that you're going to talk to your suppliers, customers, and agree how you could do some kind of supply chain analysis, how you can all save money by getting the deliveries done at a time that works for everybody rather than a time that works for one. The critical thing to do is agree up front how the rewards are going to be distributed across the supply chain. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the other thing you can do is you can negotiate. I've worked with loads of people, And experience is not the same as capability. I've had people say, I've got 30 years experience in this. And I'm thinking, have you? Or have you got 1 year's experience 30 times? It's not the same thing. Most people that negotiate, they use what they call cognitive shortcuts. So they think, well, that sort of behaviour worked for me in the past. That's probably why I was effective. And in a lot of cases that isn't the case. I guess I've got two golden rules for negotiation. The first is don't persuade them that what you want is right. But if you've got to negotiate, you need to think about reciprocity. So you need to think about, what's in this for me? This is not a one-way street. The second golden rule is nothing is for nothing. Make sure if you give something away, you get something in return. But what a lot of people do is they say, well, I make these unilateral concessions because it creates goodwill, right? But it doesn't really. It's a bit like chucking steaks to a tiger, hoping they're going to become a vegetarian, isn't it? What happens is if you start giving stuff away, people just make more and more requests for the same stuff. Deal with the right people. Now, if say, for instance, what's your name, sir?
Richard Harnett.
Right, OK. Now, I'm not going to pick on you. It's not like a stand-up comedy thing. So if I'm negotiating with Richard and he can make the decision and I can't, who's got the power? Richard. I would say this is a paradox because I don't think he has. If Richard can make the decision and I can't, he can put me under as much pressure as he likes and I still say no because I have to say no. If I put him under the right pressure, he'll make the concessions. So what you have to do is you need to make sure you're dealing with the right people in your negotiations, not someone that's too far down the food chain. Don't confuse collaboration with compromising. If I collaborate with you, I would say to you, I have needs that need to be met, and I understand that you have needs that need to be met as well. We both need to get our needs met. That's collaboration. The problem is, most people confuse collaboration with compromising, and when you compromise, you give away something that is a bit important to you, and so do they. So you're equally fed up with the outcome, but it looks fair. So the issue is, don't confuse collaboration with compromising. What compromisers do is they split things down the middle, and as soon as people realise that the primary way you deal with conflict is to compromise, they just ask for more. And the last thing is, understand the negotiation rules. There are certain cultural norms, societal norms in the way that people negotiate, and what you've got to do is you need to understand that. Final thoughts? If you're a supplier, you're on your own. You've got to man up. You've got to negotiate better. You've got to start facing up to some of these retailers. You've got to have a strategy that is going to work so you are not entirely dependent on one customer. Retailers, don't be the flabby bit of the waterbed, right? So what you need to be doing is you need to manage your suppliers proactively. I would always say make sure they're part of your plan rather than you're part of their plan. And what do? We help you reduce costs, but mainly what we do is we're a negotiation consultancy, and sometimes we'll go do this on a no-win, no-fee, but we'll come in, we'll negotiate deals with you, but not only that, we'll work with you to make sure your people are better negotiators at the end of it, and we've got a gift for you. What we're going to do is we're going to run a one-day negotiation seminar, and we're going to run it in the HTA offices, and we're going to ask people to send in an email if they want to come. And if they want to come, we'll pick out 6, and we're going to do that at our expense. And if you're interested, if you thought this was not the dullest seminar you've been to since you've been here, I've got an e-book about the 30-day negotiation challenge, and if you send me your email address, I'll send that over to you so you can have that. So remember, you don't get what's fair, you get what you negotiate.